As we continue with our series of messages from the Gospel of Mark, I would ask you to open your Bibles once again to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. And for right now, we're just going to read verses 21 through 24. Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. In virtually every movie or TV show you watch, you have a main plot and you have a subplot. The main plot is the main storyline. It's the primary focus of attention in the movie or the TV show. The subplot is a secondary storyline that involves a different character or set of characters that are usually unrelated to the main plot. Well, in our scripture text today, Mark gives us a main plot and a subplot. The main plot, or the main storyline, involves this dying 12-year-old daughter of a synagogue ruler. That's the main plot. The subplot, or the secondary storyline, involves a desperate woman who has battled a bleeding issue for 12 years. Now, while these two stories are unrelated, they do share this in common. Both involve seemingly impossible situations. And both are true stories of incredible faith. First, let's look at the main plot, or the main storyline in our text. It involves the desperate father and his dying daughter. Jesus and his disciples have now sailed from Gadara, where he healed that demoniac who had thousands of demons in him. They have now sailed from there back across the Sea of Galilee to Capernaum. And it didn't take long for word to get out that Jesus was back. And soon a great multitude gathered around Jesus down by the seashore. Well, a man named Jairus makes his way through the crowd that day, and he bowed down before Jesus. Jairus was one of the rulers of the synagogue. His duties would have been primarily administrative rather than priestly duties. He looked after the building. He supervised the worship services. But as he is there kneeling before Jesus, he doesn't do so as a ruler of the synagogue. He doesn't do so as somebody who is important in the community. But rather, he kneels before Jesus as a loving, caring father of a little 12-year-old girl who's back home dying. Now, in our human way of thinking, this isn't the way things are supposed to be. Children are not supposed to leave this world before their parents. That's just not natural. This little girl ought to be out laughing and playing with the other children her age. This is the age when she ought to be having her first crush, her first boyfriend. She's at an age where she should begin spreading her wings a little bit as she makes that transition from preteen into a teenager. That's the way things should be, but it's not the way things are. Instead of doing what normal little 12-year-old girls are doing, this little girl's at home dying in her bed. And there's a very good possibility she won't live to see her 13th birthday. And so this desperate father has come bowing before Jesus as his only hope. Listen to the tremendous faith in Jairus' plea to Jesus. Verse 23, Jairus says to Jesus, "Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live." There's absolutely no doubt in Jairus' mind that Jesus can do the impossible. That he can do what no one else can do. Heal his daughter and spare her life. Now it's interesting to note that Jesus does not verbally respond to Jairus. He doesn't say a word that we find recorded in the text here. Instead, he simply starts moving in the direction of Jairus' home. He starts moving in the direction of Jairus' faith. Jairus' faith points him to his daughter. Jairus' faith says, "I know you can heal her. I know she will live if you can just touch her." And so Jesus, without saying a word, just starts moving in that direction. And the multitude goes along with them. And you can understand that. They're anxious to see what's going to happen. They're anxious to see what Jesus is going to do. Well, just like in the movies and the TV shows, Mark now brings us to a pause in the main plot, as he now introduces the subplot, or the secondary storyline. Let's pick up the record in verses 25 through 34 as we meet the desperate woman and her dreadful condition. Verse 25. "Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well.' Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus immediately, knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' His disciples said to him, 'You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, "Who touched me?" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your affliction.'" Mark tells us this woman had a flow of blood. King James refers to it as an issue of blood. The NIV says that she was subject to bleeding. Now, we're not told the specifics of her disorder, but we do know that she suffered from some kind of hemorrhaging from someplace on her body. And whatever this condition was, it had all but ruined her life. Under Levitical law, this bleeding caused this woman to be ceremonially unclean. Now let me explain the ramifications of that so you understand the seriousness of this woman's situation. I think we probably have read this account over and over again and just thought, well, she was bleeding, no big deal. But this was a serious issue, spiritually, physically, and emotionally, for this woman. Because she was ceremonially unclean, she could not enter the women's court of the temple to worship. In other words, she hadn't been to church in 12 years. She was not allowed to go into the place where the women worshiped at the temple because she was unclean. Now, she was also not allowed to mingle in public places because if she touched anyone, they too would become ceremonially unclean. If she was single, her bleeding disorder would not permit her to get married, because in doing so she would defile her husband and make him ceremonially unclean. If she was married, her bleeding disorder was grounds for her husband to divorce her because she could not perform her marital duties. She was also not allowed to work outside the home, because working around others would put them at risk of being made ceremonially unclean. So we need to understand this was more than just an embarrassing physical problem. It had all but ruined this woman's life. She had become a prisoner in her own home. And ironically, this had been going on for 12 years, which means that her bleeding disorder started the same year that Jairus' daughter was born. Some Bible scholars even believe that this woman may have been in her mid to late 20s. You know, we kind of picture her being an old woman here. That's probably not the case. Many picture or believe that she was probably in her mid to late 20s, and that her bleeding issue may have actually started when she herself was 12 years old, like Jairus' daughter. Verse 26 tells us this poor woman's suffering was made even worse by all the doctors that she had gone to see to get some help. Rabbi Jackanan, a Jewish scholar, describes the type of concoctions and remedies that this poor woman was likely subjected to in those days. Listen to this. It's comical, but it's also sad. Her doctor may have said to her, take of gum Alexandria, of alum, and of crocus hortensis, the weight of a zuzi each. Let them be bruised together, given in wine to the woman that hath the issue of blood. But if this fail, in other words, if this doesn't work, do this. Take of Persian onions, 9 logs, boil them in wine, and give it to her to drink, and say, arise from thy flux. Flux meaning her flow. But should this fail, if that doesn't work, set her in a place where 2 ways meet. Let her hold a cup of wine in her hand, and let somebody come behind her and affright her. In other words, scare her. You know, like when somebody's got hiccups. And say, arise from thy flux. But if this doesn't work, take a handful of cumin, and a handful of crocus, and a handful of fenugreek. Let these be boiled, and given to her in a drink, and say, arise from thy flux. But if that doesn't work, dig 7 trenches, and burn in them some cuttings of vines not yet circumcised, vines that are not yet 4 years old, and let her take in her hand a cup of wine, and let her be led from this trench, and set down over that. Sit down in the burning vines, and let her be removed from that. In other words, let her move from one spot to the next, and sit down over another, and in each removal say to her, arise from thy flux. Now that just wore me out reading. Can you imagine how worn out this poor woman was with trying all these nonsensical concoctions and remedies? And verse 28 tells us she had spent all she had on these remedies, and she had nothing to show for it. The doctors had drained this poor woman dry financially, and her condition only got worse. And so Mark tells us this woman heard about Jesus. We don't know if a loving relative told her about him, or if she knew someone had been healed by Jesus. But somehow she heard about Jesus. And imagine the tremendous faith and courage that it required of this woman to risk coming out in public to meet Jesus. As she elbows her way through that huge multitude of people that day, she was defiling every person she touched. She was causing everybody that she touched to become ceremonially unclean. And if she was recognized by anyone, she would have been bombarded with ridicule and public humiliation, and possibly have even put herself in grave danger of being stoned to death. But this was a risk she had to take, and Jesus was her one and only hope. Now it's interesting when you contrast this woman's faith and the faith of Jairus, the father of the dying girl. Jairus had faith that if Jesus touched his daughter, that she would be healed and live. This woman with the bleeding disorder, on the other hand, believed if she could touch Jesus, that she would be healed. There was a common superstition back in those days that the power of a person was transmitted through his clothing. And so, the very moment this woman touched or grabbed a hold of Jesus' garment, the bleeding stopped. It completely dried up. And she was immediately healed. The woman knew immediately that she was healed. And Jesus knew immediately that someone had been healed. Because Jesus felt the healing power go out of his body into someone else. He knew someone had been healed, but not who. And so Jesus stopped and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples' response reveals that they thought Jesus' question was rather ridiculous. Listen to what they said. They said, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" In other words, the disciples were saying, "Who isn't touching you, Lord? Everybody and his brother's touching you." Now, maybe we need to cut the disciples a little slack here. Because maybe they saw this delay as preventing Jesus to getting to the real emergency, Jairus' dying daughter. Maybe they were just trying to keep Jesus moving along because there was no time for delay. So maybe we need to cut them a little bit of slack. But Jesus was insistent on finding out who touched his garment in that crowd. Not to rebuke that person, but to make personal contact with them. He wanted them to know that it was because of their faith they had been healed and not because of some superstitious belief that if you touch the clothes, you'll be healed. He wanted them to know it was their faith that healed them. The woman steps forward. She falls down before Jesus. And in fear and trembling, she tells him the whole story of her 12-year-long battle with this bleeding disorder. And imagine the relief that this woman must have felt when, rather than being rebuked by Jesus, he blessed her instead. Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." Now, it's at this point Mark takes us back to the main plot for the dramatic conclusion to the true story of Jairus' daughter. Let's consider the divine Savior and the miraculous resurrection. Let's pick up the record in verse 35 down to verse 43. While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and he saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. And then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given to her to eat. Jairus has just received the worst news that any parent can possibly receive. Your daughter is dead. In an instant, Jairus' whole world comes crashing down. All of his hopes have now been cruelly crushed. What if they hadn't been delayed by that woman with the blood issue? What if they had gotten to Jairus' house just a few minutes earlier? What if? What if? But now it's too late. And in essence, that's what the messengers told Jairus. Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? In other words, there's no need to take up any more of Jesus' time. It's too late for him or anyone else to do anything now. It is never too late for the Lord of the impossible. Let me say that again and listen. It is never too late for the Lord of the impossible. In essence, Jesus told Jairus, don't listen to the messengers, listen to me. Do not be afraid, only believe. Well, Jairus certainly believed that Jesus could have healed his daughter while she was still alive. But now she's dead. It's too late. She's gone. And Jesus is asking him to believe that he can still do something. What Jesus was asking him to do was not easy. In fact, it was the hardest thing anybody had ever asked Jairus to do in his whole life. Do not be afraid, only believe. It's at this point Jesus separates himself from the huge multitude that had been following him. He also has 9 of his 12 apostles stay back with the multitude, and only Peter, James, and John are permitted to go on with him to Jairus' house. Jesus is about to do something impossible. He is about to bring life back into the dead body of that little girl. And he only wants a chosen few to see it. When they arrive at Jairus' house, there's absolute chaos and confusion. Family members were crying. Neighbors and friends were crying. There were perhaps dozens of professional mourners at the house. Now, what is a professional mourner? Well, I'm glad you asked. In the Eastern culture of Jesus' day, people actually paid others to go to their home when someone had died to wail loudly. They got paid to do this. Today, when someone dies, we quickly spread the news on our cell phones, either through a call or through a text message. They didn't have phones back then. They had professional mourners. And the duty of a professional mourner was to wail as loudly as they could to let everybody in the whole neighborhood know that someone has just died in this home. And they would continue wailing until the person was buried. Sometimes the professional mourners knew the deceased, sometimes they didn't, in which case they just cried crocodile tears. And so when Jesus arrives at Jairus' house and he sees this mass hysteria and hears all this loud wailing, he said, what's all this commotion and crying about? The child isn't dead, she's only sleeping. Verse 40 says, and they ridiculed him. They laughed at Jesus. They made fun of Jesus. What do you think we are, a bunch of idiots? Don't you think we know the difference between someone being asleep and someone being dead? Do we look stupid? Well, at this point, Jesus quickly ushers everyone away, except for Jairus and his wife, and Peter, James, and John. They enter the room where the little girl is lying lifeless on her bed. Jesus walks over to her. He takes her little hand in his. He says, Talitha Kumai. Little girl, get up. Little girl, it's time to rise and shine. He's waking her out of her sleep. Talitha Kumai. Little girl, get up. The little girl opens her eyes. She gets up, she starts walking around the room. She did what little 12-year-old girls do. She's active. She starts moving around. And Jairus and his wife, and Peter, James, and John are standing there with their chins on the floor. That's what Mark means when he says they were overcome with great amazement. And you know, maybe it's the Norwegian in me. I've got a little mean streak here. I would love to have seen the faces on those professional mourners when that little girl walked out of the house the first time. They just made fun of Jesus. I would love to see the looks on their faces when she came out and ran down the street for the first time. As we bring this message to a close, I want to drive home this powerful truth this morning. This is the takeaway from this message. That is, all things are possible through Christ. All things are possible through Christ. Let's go back over what we just learned in these last few messages. If Jesus could calm the storm on the sea, if Jesus could drive thousands of demons out of that demoniac in Gadara, if Jesus could heal that woman who had had a bleeding disorder for 12 years, if Jesus could bring life back into that dead little 12-year-old girl, do you think there's any situation in your life that Jesus cannot handle? Do you believe?
Yeah.
Do you believe?
Yeah.
That's what Jesus is asking. Do you believe? Perhaps you're dealing with a situation in your life right now that is completely out of your control. It has completely overwhelmed you. And perhaps you have tried everything you know to try. You've done everything you know to do. And you've talked to everybody you know to talk to. And your situation is no better. Have you taken it to Jesus? Do you believe in the Lord of the impossible? Don't be afraid. Only believe. I don't know what you're dealing with this morning. I don't know what that situation may be in your life, but I do know this. Jesus can do the impossible. Jesus is your answer when no one else is. All things are possible to them who believe. And all of God's people say, we're going to sing our invitation this morning. Softly and tenderly, Jesus.